After the carnage of the American Civil War, the country was still left with the difficult task of Reconstruction. But the surviving leaders of the Confederacy had to reconstruct their whole lives, some for better and others for worse. So, how do you get pardoned but not really get pardoned? Well, to answer that question, let's look at Jefferson Davis. Before the North and South split into warring factions, Jefferson Davis was a real patriot who served the Union in many ways. He fought in the Mexican-American War, and after a short term in the House of Representatives, President Franklin Pierce appointed him Secretary of War in 1853. While acting as a senator from Mississippi, with secession looming, Davis served on a committee that tried to negotiate a compromise and avoid war. But when Mississippi left the Union, Davis abdicated his seat. At an 1861 meeting of the Confederate Congress, Davis was chosen to be president of the Confederacy for a 6-year term. But when the Civil War ended 4 years later, Davis found himself president of a country that no longer existed. At war's end, Davis made a hasty exit from the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, to avoid Union troops. They arrested him in Georgia 5 weeks later. You may have heard a story about him dressing as a woman to escape authorities. He wasn't. Davis served 2 years in prison, and he was released in 1867 after a contingent of wealthy prominent Unionists put up his $100,000 bail. After traveling through Canada, Cuba, and Europe, Davis was due to be tried for treason in early 1869. For a variety of reasons, including the possibility that a jury of Virginians might acquit Davis and obliquely legitimize the secession, the court dropped the charges. Davis retired to an estate in Mississippi. Davis, however, was not fully granted his U.S. citizenship back. Here's a short version of a lot of chest-sticking-out politics. Davis did not ask for a pardon as he didn't feel like he needed one. Andrew Johnson's 1868 blanket pardon excluded Davis, and he wasn't about to ask for a pardon. Anyway, there in Biloxi, he wrote his memoir and nearly took back his Senate seat until it was decided that his role during the Civil War disqualified him from holding the job. Again, he wasn't a citizen, so how's he going to be a senator? Davis died in 1889. I know you're wondering, did he get his citizenship back? Yes, Jimmy Carter restored Davis's citizenship in 1978. Let me introduce you to the only Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Hamilton Stevens. A Georgia state representative and senator promoted to U.S. House of Representatives in 1843, Stevens held his seat until 1859. He supported states' rights and compromise legislation that delayed but didn't stop the Civil War. The Confederate Congress picked Stevens to be vice president partly because of his moderate bent. They also wanted to show they understood irony. On one hand, he didn't want the South to secede. On the other hand, he said this. You can read it. Go ahead. But hey, Stevens got to have his face on the new nation's money, so there's that. Stevens tried to negotiate an armistice with the U.S. government in 1865. He met with Lincoln himself and wanted the Union to basically stop the war and leave the South alone as their own country. Guess what? Lincoln turned it down. Eventually, he was arrested and sent to the prison at Fort Warren in Boston. 5 months later, he was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson. He immediately tried to get back into politics and in 1866 won a seat in the U.S. Senate, but they refused to seat him. And that makes sense. He was vice president of the Confederacy after all. It was way too soon to give him political clout. At least we think so. But in 1873, Stevens won a seat in the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, he wrote books including an account of his activities during the Civil War and a U.S. history book. It would be interesting to see how he decided to write about the Civil War. Stevens died in 1883 at age 71, just months after being inaugurated as the governor of Georgia. When it looked as if the southern states would secede, Robert E. Lee was offered command of the Union forces.
I never thought I'd live to see the day that the President of the United States would raise an army to invade his own country.
Instead, the Virginia-born Lee quit the U.S. Army in 1861 and was made the commander of Virginia's armed forces. Ultimately, the Confederacy's leading military mind throughout the Civil War, Lee was present at many important battles and served as an advisor to President Davis. He was also the guy who signed the surrender. In April 1865, General Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Lee's rank meant that he was excluded from President Johnson's initial amnesty order for Confederate soldiers in May 1865, but Lee signed an amnesty oath in October. There's a big but, though. Lee's amnesty oath got lost in the post-war chaos, and it wasn't found again until 1970, when it was dug out of the National Archives. So in 1975, 105 years after his death, Congress and President Gerald Ford restored Lee's U.S. citizenship. Months after the war, Lee testified before Congress about race relations, among other things. He stated that black people should be allowed to attend school but not be given the right to vote. He didn't really comment publicly on the war, but he encouraged the South to basically move on and accept their status back within the U.S. With his home and plantation in Virginia taken over by the U.S. government during the Civil War and turned into a cemetery, you may have heard of it, Arlington, Lee spent the rest of his life as the president of Virginia's Washington College. He died in 1870. They honored him by changing the name of the school to Washington and Lee University. Judah P. Benjamin is quite a character, and his story should be advertised a lot more. A Louisiana senator, he quit in 1861 to defect to the newly formed Confederacy, where he was appointed Attorney General. Also serving as Secretary of War and Secretary of State, Benjamin was President Davis's unofficial top advisor, and by far the top-ranked Confederate who was also Jewish. He took the blame for numerous Confederate blunders, such as when the Union captured Roanoke Island in North Carolina. Benjamin's high-level Confederacy activities came to an end after 1864 when he made his speech to the rogue nation Senate, in which he suggested freeing any enslaved people who volunteered to fight. The idea was soundly rejected. For what it's worth, Benjamin was known as the brains of the Confederacy and was a pretty sharp cookie. He did negotiate a loan from France, but failed to get any troop support. In the last year of the war, with the Confederacy consistently outmatched by the well-provisioned Union forces, Benjamin and other members of the Davis administration moved around the South as Northern troops advanced. Just after the end of the war, Secretary of State William Seward investigated Benjamin's role in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There was ample evidence that Benjamin had operated a Confederate spy network that included assassin John Wilkes Booth.
Sic semper tyrannis! The South shall be free!
Suspecting what was coming for him would not be pleasant, Benjamin fled the country. The details of his escape are slim and heavily mythologized. One account has him pretending to be French.
J'ai boubou, Claude. Slepou la lou bla blue.
This could be true because Benjamin lived out his life in England, working as an attorney by the name of Philippe Benjamin until his death in 1884. He was buried in Paris in the famous Père Lachaise cemetery under his real name, with his real resume engraved on the stone. The Confederate Constitution differed from the U.S. Constitution in that it explicitly established states' rights and championed slavery. The main author of the document was Christopher Memminger, a lawyer selected to head up the CSA's Treasury Department. For that, he got to put his face on the Confederate $5 bill. Memminger was also a member of the South Carolina State House and a political theorist who wrote The Book of Nullification, an anti-federal government screed on the importance of states' rights. This led to a spot at the Secession Convention of South Carolina, where Memminger helped make his state the first to leave the U.S. As treasurer, Memminger was tasked with running a country that at first had no currency and only the dregs of an economy, thanks to the U.S. blockade that prevented the export of Confederate cotton. Pardoned by President Andrew Johnson for his wartime activities in 1867, Memminger returned to South Carolina's state legislature, where he worked as the head of the Ways and Means Committee to help reestablish the state's war-ravaged credit. Memminger then served as Charleston's public schools commissioner, calling for compulsory education for children of all races. After calling for a railroad to unite the disparate regions of the state, Memminger took a position as the president of a railroad company. He died in 1888. The Confederacy's military tactics were primarily defensive, but its armies did make a few attempts to invade the Union states. The last of these was Pickett's Charge during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Pickett's Charge is remembered as a somewhat romantic last-ditch effort to win the battle. In reality, it was more of a sacrifice.
George, can you take that bridge?
No, he could not. During the battle, Confederate soldiers stormed Cemetery Ridge, running straight at the enemy in an open field. It was all over in an hour, leaving 6,555 Southern soldiers dead. And although he doesn't necessarily deserve as much of the blame as his superiors, his name will forever be synonymous with the failure. Worried that he'd be tried for war crimes for his role in the execution of 22 Union prisoners, a genuine war crime by every definition, Pickett fled the U.S. for Canada at war's end. Once he'd learned he wasn't wanted for war crimes, thanks to the intervention of his friend, then President Ulysses S. Grant, Pickett returned to Virginia where he ran his farm and worked in the insurance business. In 1874, Pickett was pardoned by Congress for making war on the Union. He died 13 months later. Robert E. Lee nicknamed General James Longstreet Old Warhorse, and he would turn out to be one of the Confederacy's most reliable generals. Longstreet commanded soldiers in some of the most important battles of the Civil War, including the Battle of Manassas and the pivotal deadly Battle of Gettysburg, where he was put in charge of the Pickett's charge debacle. Why that epic failure isn't known as Longstreet's charge among Southerners when he was the man behind the orders is a good question. Longstreet's record ended with a win for the Confederacy at the Battle of Chickamauga, after which he was injured by friendly fire in Virginia. Longstreet made it back to the front lines just in time for Lee's surrender. Longstreet has a complicated relationship with the South. In the glorification of Lee, Longstreet often gets the brunt of a lot of battlefield failures. Why, you ask? Well, he joined the slain President Lincoln's Republican Party as it instituted sweeping reforms throughout the South. Settling in New Orleans, Longstreet made a fortune in the insurance and railroad businesses. He was disliked by the Southern Democratic political establishment due to his increasingly pro-Northern views he openly espoused in newspaper editorials. So in 1875, Longstreet moved to Gainesville, Georgia, where he bought a farm and a hotel, held local political positions, and eventually served as the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. After a brief period as a U.S. Marshal in Atlanta, he was hit with corruption charges and fired. Longstreet retired to his farm and lived there until his death in 1904. Before the outset of the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a millionaire thanks to his cotton plantation, his real estate and livestock investments, and his thriving business as a trader of enslaved people. When war was declared, Forrest enlisted in the Confederate Army as a private, but he abandoned his post in order to form and fund his own military unit. Despite his utter lack of military training, Forrest was given the rank of lieutenant colonel. He and his troops fought at Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh. He eventually rose to the rank of major general with no apparent qualifications but his social status and wealth. But in 1864, Forrest's men laid waste to the Union stronghold of Fort Pillow, after which they summarily executed many of the surviving black troops. Forrest surrendered at the war's end, but he didn't surrender his racist ideology. Well, not at first. The Ku Klux Klan began as a Confederate Veterans Club, but it was reborn as a network of political organizations and hate groups in 1868, under the direction of Forrest, who became the revived KKK's first top official or Grand Wizard. The Klan, with Forrest in charge, executed a campaign of terror, violence, and intimidation with the goal of preventing formerly enslaved people from exercising their right to vote. In fact, they were rabid in their mission. In the run-up to the 1868 elections, Forrest's group of hooded and robed Klan members were among a laundry list of racist organizations that murdered more than 3,000 black people. So, back to what I said earlier, why not at first, considering all that Klan stuff? You see, in 1875, Forrest gave a speech to a majority Freeman crowd and said, "We were born on the same soil, breathe the same air, and live in the same land. Why then can we not live as brothers?" He ended his speech by planting a kiss on the cheek of a freed black woman. Of course, history is complicated. By that time, the KKK was basically a nothing organization and wouldn't return until Woodrow Wilson's presidency. That guy again. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback his intentions, but there's no denying he gave the speech. Forrest died in 1877 with a complicated standing among Southerners. Today, he's remembered for the Klan stuff, and rightly so, but there's more to him than that. Born at Monticello, George W. Randolph was the grandson of Thomas Jefferson. He would eventually serve in the U.S. Navy and earn his law degree from the University of Virginia. After John Brown attempted to lead a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry in 1859, Randolph, by then a Richmond City Council member, reacted by creating a rogue military regiment. Within the first few months of the Civil War, he was commissioned as an officer in the Confederate Army. And by 1862, Jefferson Davis named him Secretary of War, although they often disagreed on military strategies. So much so that Randolph resigned after 8 months on the job. Between his political disagreements with Davis and a case of tuberculosis, Randolph decided to leave the U.S. for Europe in November 1864, sneaking aboard a smuggler's ship to avoid the blockade. He waited for the post-war fallout and arrest to die down before signing a loyalty oath and returning to the reconstituted U.S. in September 1866. A month later, he lost his ability to speak, and 6 months after that, Randolph died of tuberculosis at his family's plantation in Virginia.